Hi, I'm John Cox, and this is Vagabond Vox. Today we're going to be talking about narcissistic personality disorder, otherwise known as NPD. The reason I wanted to talk about narcissistic personality disorder is that it seems more and more common for people to be throwing around this label of narcissist on all kinds of people in their life. Like it almost seems like we all know tons of narcissists, and those people happen to be our toxic ex partner, our ex boss, or some other person that has slighted us in some way, or we've had some sort of falling out with or disagreement with. And this label just gets thrown around really cavalierly. And I thought it'd be interesting to do a little bit of a deep dive and talk about it. I was actually pursuing a master's in forensic behavioral analysis, which is a deep study into personality disorders and sexual paraphilias. I did end up dropping out due to just life stuff, but it still is a topic that I find very interesting, and I thought it'd be really fun to talk about today. So, my goals for today are to explain fully what narcissistic personality disorder actually is, to deep dive into narcissistic personality traits, which I think is what most of us mean, what we really mean when we're labeling people in our lives as narcissists, is that they display some narcissistic traits, which in fact I believe we all do, and I'll talk more about that later in the episode. And I wanted to present some alternative ways of looking at toxic behavior and another way to look at people in our lives that we've had falling outs with, that have treated us poorly, in a little bit more of an empowering manner that's a little bit better educated and a bit less hasty to use labels. So we're going to start back over 2,000 years ago to the year 8 CE, where we first see mention of a man from Greek mythology known as Narcissus. Narcissus was a man, a very beautiful man that was so in love with himself that he had absolutely no interest really in other people and was incapable of falling in love with anyone else. And he became so self-centered that the gods cursed him to see his own reflection in a pool of water and to fall in love with it, and then to just get mesmerized by his own reflection and eventually waste away and die doing nothing but staring at himself. That's sort of the short version of this story, but the takeaway here is that Narcissus was a man that was only interested in himself and not interested in anyone else. Very, very self-centered. And that is the basic definition of what a narcissist is someone that is purely, completely, 100% self-centered, does not think or worry about anyone else except in whatever way other people can help them achieve their own ends. So narcissism as a psychological label or subject was not really part of the conversation of psychology as we know it today until relatively recently in the late 1800s. And then it became quite popular with all of the psychiatrists and psychologists of the early and mid 1900s as well, Freud among them, of course. And it wasn't actually until 1980 that narcissistic personality disorder was added to the DSM-3. The DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is kind of the Bible of mental disorders that is used by psychologists and psychiatrists today. The latest DSM is the DSM-5, which actually came out not too long ago. And the definition of NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, in the DSM-5 is as follows: a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy with interpersonal entitlement, exploitativeness, arrogance, and envy. So there are 9 personality and behavioral criteria that we call narcissistic traits. And in order for someone to be formally diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, they need to display at least 5 out of those 9 traits. And those traits are as follows: a grandiose sense of self-importance, fantasies of unlimited success, intelligence, beauty, and power, and ideal love, a belief that they are truly special and unique and can only be understood by and should only associate with other top-tier, special, unique people, and anyone else is not really worth their time or attention. They require excessive admiration from others. There's a sense of entitlement with unrealistic expectations that anyone else around them is going to give them exactly what they want when they want it and will automatically comply with whatever their expectations or requests are. Interpersonally exploitative. In other words, they will take advantage of every relationship they have and anyone that's in their life to help them achieve their own benefits and ends, regardless of the collateral damage or consequences on those people or anyone else. Lacking in empathy. That is, they are unwilling and unable to understand or identify the feelings and needs of others. There's also envy of others or a belief that all other people are very envious of them. And finally, an arrogant, haughty behavior that's generally always present. So those are the 9 behavioral and personality criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. And I imagine as I was going through those 9, there was at least a few of those criteria that made you think of someone you know, or maybe even made you think of yourself. And that is because every person displays at least one of these traits sometimes in their life. It might be a more permanent fixture of one's personality, or it might be a behavior or feeling that comes out when someone is under stress or in very specific circumstances. So, how common is narcissism, true narcissistic personality disorder, NPD? The best estimates are that somewhere between 0.5% to 5% of the population have NPD. Interestingly, this is biased very heavily towards men, with about 50 to 75% of those having NPD being men, which may also be why the mythological figure Narcissus was written as a man. NPD is very tricky to formally diagnose, and that is because there's really no standardized test for it like there are for some other personality disorders and other health ailments and mental ailments. So really the only way to properly diagnose someone is when a skilled and trained psychologist or psychiatrist is able to sit down and talk to them extensively, ask them a lot of questions, and are able to identify at least 5 of those 9 traits, and are also able to rule out any other mental issues or other circumstances that may be indicative of those traits. So what happens after someone is diagnosed with NPD? Well, usually a lot of denial, because this may not come as a surprise, but someone that is narcissistic, that has narcissistic personality disorder, has a really hard time accepting or believing that anything is wrong with them. And even narcissistic people know that narcissism is generally considered to be bad. That is not something that you want to be. So they're going to have a very, very hard time accepting that this is who they are. And as I'm sure you can imagine, that makes treating it very difficult. And it's difficult to treat this even for people that are potentially willing to explore treatment. Every person with NPD that is willing to undergo treatment will likely go through a plethora of treatment options, ranging from mood stabilizing drugs to cognitive behavioral therapy to talk therapy. But this really is a very small percentage of people that are willing to undergo any sort of treatment for this. And that is why, for those of us unfortunate enough to have a true narcissist in our life, whether they are a romantic partner or a family member or boss, you really have to accept that there is nothing you can do to save that person. The best thing you can do, and the thing you must do, is to set very, very strong boundaries between you and that person to keep you from just becoming a tool in their toolbox to exploit so that they can better themselves. So, advancing the discussion closer to the present day, narcissism is being talked about and studied and is in the social zeitgeist more than it's ever been before. In fact, since 2010, there has been a minimum of 350 peer-reviewed articles being published every year pertaining to narcissism. And I don't believe that date of 2010 is an accident, but we will explain that a little bit more later. Interestingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, evidence shows that Western cultures like the United States tend to have many more cases of NPD and just a higher incidence of narcissistic traits being displayed by people in general than Eastern cultures. And the suggested reason for this, which I find pretty compelling, is that Western culture tends to be very, very individualistic. We tend to really focus on and praise and recognize the accomplishments and success of the individual here. Whereas in Eastern cultures that tend to be more collectivistic cultures, they much more identify and look at and praise the accomplishments and successes of a group as a whole rather than just the individual. So it really makes sense that there would be higher rates of narcissism in Western cultures because, as we covered, narcissistic personality disorder is all about focusing on oneself and not on anyone else. So we're sort of setting people up for failure in that regard in Western culture. So why are we seeing so much more conversation and hype, if you will, around narcissism today? There's evidence showing two primary factors that may be influencing this. The first one is actually our modern education system. And no, we're not teaching children how to be narcissists in school per se, but what we are doing is taking children and putting them in a building for several hours a day, several months a year, and we are putting them into this system and training them to be part of a system where everything they do is being given some sort of a score or grade. And the focus is really to get the best one possible and to be the best, to be perfect, to set yourself apart from your peers. And we really reward this, not just with good grades getting you into college and perhaps more career opportunities and sports opportunities, but you also get a lot of social praise in school from your professors and teachers, which are people that you look up to, but from some of your peers as well. So this really sets kids up for this mentality of trying to be the best and to set themselves apart from everyone else. The second major factor that may be contributing to a rise in narcissistic tendencies among people today is social media. And this is where I said that 2010 sudden influx of studies and incidences of narcissistic traits being shown is when social media really started taking off as we know it today. Obviously, sites like MySpace and Facebook existed more in the early 2000s, but starting around 2010 is when it really started to tick off. And now the average age at which kids are getting their first social media account is about 12 to 13. So again, when humans are at this really vulnerable, fundamental, developmental age, they're getting introduced to this technology and this social system that, again, is really praising and giving rewards to the successes and the attention of an individual. So in school, where we had those quantifiable metrics of how good you are compared to your peers being your grades, on social media, it's likes, comments, views, followers, friends. And this is literally putting a number, an actual measurable public number that everyone can see on how successful or popular you are on these things. So what's the lesson here? What's the takeaway? What do we do with this knowledge about the true meaning and definition and diagnostic criteria behind narcissistic personality disorder? Well, as I alluded to in the intro, we have a tendency to easily call anyone that we have a disagreement with or any friction with, especially ex-romantic partners and ex-bosses, to call them narcissists. And this is actually really unhelpful for you. Firstly, the only people that are actually qualified to diagnose anyone as having narcissistic personality disorder are trained psychologists and psychiatrists, which most of us are not. Secondly, many of the people that we give this label to, they may certainly display some narcissistic traits, and those traits may have really been on display if you were in some sort of negative situation or negative relationship dynamic with them. But as I mentioned earlier, there is not one person alive that does not display at least one of these traits permanently or from time to time under certain circumstances. So just arbitrarily giving someone this label of narcissist when they may not actually be a narcissist is a way of poisoning the well. That is, it's a way to take a whole being and give them one label to just reduce them into something that's objectively bad and evil. And this may feel really self-gratifying in the moment because it kind of puts us on a bit of a moral high ground when we're telling a story about a crazy situation that happened. But the dark side of that is it also creates a sort of victim perpetrator story where you are in fact the victim which is very disempowering. And what this could lead to is a pervasive story and sense that the world is full of evil narcissists and we can't trust anyone. We can't be vulnerable with anyone. And this leads us to be less present in our social situations. It can make it hard for us to have deep connections with people or to make any new connections with people. And this can lead to isolation, depression, anxiety, all kinds of other bad stuff. That all said, of course, there are absolutely narcissistic people out there that would be diagnosable by a skilled clinician, even if they have not been yet. And you do need to look out for these people. And there are really victims of these people. And I'm certainly not trying to disenfranchise those that are. But what I am suggesting is that next time you have a negative interaction with someone, or even free yourself from an entire negative situation like a relationship or job, to just take a moment before creating this black and white story where they were the bad guy, you were the good guy, they're the perpetrator, you're the victim, and recognize that one moment in time or one container of situation between two people is not necessarily indicative of the entirety of either of the people that were in that situation. And consider giving some grace to the other person and to yourself for being in that situation. At the same time, do set up strong, healthy boundaries to keep yourself from being hurt or taken advantage of by people that truly do have narcissistic personality disorder or that are displaying narcissistic traits. In the words of Taylor Swift, may your heart remain breakable, but never by the same hand twice. I would really love to hear in the comment section any stories that you might have or interactions that you've had with people that you really think are narcissists or had narcissistic traits. And if you're feeling particularly vulnerable, perhaps you could consider sharing any of the narcissistic traits that I read off that you might feel you suffer from time to time. Thank you so much for coming on this bit of an exploratory journey with me today in narcissistic personality disorder. We covered the mythological history of it over 2,000 years ago, when it entered and became a term used in psychology, and the rising prevalence of narcissistic traits today, what the causes are, and how we can deal with potentially narcissistic people in the future. As always, for the videos I do that are a bit more on the educational side, please see the video description for all the sources that I used if you'd like to learn more.